not evening yet. Um, Starting a little earlier tonight, but we are excited to launch our summer series for Wednesday nights. I know some of you who are here have come because you've dropped your children off for Maker Camp, and I know they're going to have a lot of fun tonight. They're making a rocket, which should be a lot of fun. They're probably having more fun than we will in here, but we'll see how it goes. But basically, our heart in this next 6 weeks, outside of July 3rd, which we won't have anything on that night, we're going to just be talking about what does it mean to be a holy human. And the heart of the idea of being a holy human is that we want to talk about the places where sexuality and spirituality kind of overlap or almost are identical to each other. Um, our hope is that we will be able to see these things come very clear, like from the scriptures. I've done a good amount of research. This is not an end-all be-all conversation. Just want to say that we're in process as we're studying and researching and learning. This is also not necessarily a course on how to interact with certain topics that are around sexuality in culture right now. We're not necessarily going into that conversation. We're really trying to focus on what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be an image bearer? What does it mean to be male and female? What does it mean to understand that my sexuality is saying so much about my spiritual life, whether I realize it or not? We're going to be talking about freedom. We're going to be talking about love, what it is, what it isn't, and how all of those things intersect and how they all weave and overlap with each other. And so I thought that tonight we're going to be talking about the image of God in humanity, and we're going to be talking about the same and the difference that are there. But we're also going to be kind of couching everything in the idea that our sexuality says a whole lot about our spirituality and vice versa. So I wanted to start with just a little story. And the story is called Sex in the Library. So growing up, my parents were really great, wonderful humans that taught me a lot about biology and about procreation and the birds and the bees, and it was wonderful. But I was a very curious human being. And not to be weird, but I didn't really want to talk to my parents about that topic, because you started to realize I exist because of what they did. And so you had that moment where you're like, I don't really want to talk to them about it, but I live 3 blocks from the library, and I love the library. My whole life, I've been an avid reader. It's probably the biggest hobby I ever had in my life. And so I would walk 3 blocks all the time, go into the library, and you better bet that I used that library to understand as much as I possibly could about sex once I first was introduced to it. Now, I'm not saying that that was a good thing by any stretch. I was definitely in areas that I probably shouldn't have been at the young age of 9, 10, 11, 12. But really, more than anything, wanting and understanding that there was something more going on than just the very act of 2 people coming together and having a child. And so I was laughing because as I was thinking through this picture, I think that what happened for me is that then I went to church and it was like radio silence. And the only thing in church that we ever really talked about concerning sex was prohibition. Do not have it before you are married. And then when you're married, do it, but don't talk to anybody about it. And so it was very much like couched in that reality. And it was sad to me that I learned more from the library than I ever did from the church. And, like I said, big nerd, lots of reading. I read the Bible. I read tons of things in the Bible, but I really didn't understand what the Bible was talking about most of the time when it was talking about sex. Because truthfully, most of my understanding of it was couched in the understanding of what had been informed to me or not informed to me, or what I had learned on my own, but I didn't really have in community or with people who could have helped me understand it in a bigger way. And so what I realized, I think, is that the church gave me this very G-rated, very proper, very clean understanding of it. And then I went to the library and it was a very adults only, not just scientific, much more around pleasure and enjoyment. And then beyond that, it really just turned into a lot of tangled mess, because that's what I was viewing. was these pictures and these, books in the library that were revealing sex to be a tangled mess in my mind as a very young child. And I think for so many of us, we're still struggling with some of that entanglement. Whether your experiences with sex have been good or bad, we're still a lot of times wrestling through these things very deeply, because it's like, what's the line of what I've learned from the library and what I've learned from the church, right? Or it could be a sex ed class, or it could be, I wrote down in my notes, or the school bus. I feel like I learned the most about sex from the school bus, more than library, but I didn't know what they were talking about half the time, because they were using code language on the school bus. And so I think that all of this really changed for me when about 17, 18 years ago, I was in my first master's program, and I tripped across this little book that was talking about some of these things. And the question that the author said is that a lot of times when we read the Bible, what the Bible is talking about is not just about what the Bible is talking about. So for instance, when you're talking about Jacob and a bowl of beans that he sold to his brother, you're not actually talking about a bowl of beans. You're talking about this whole birthright inheritance picture that you're not thinking about. Or circumcision in the Bible. It's like, clearly this is not just about removing the foreskin. There's something else going on. And this author simply said that most of the Bible is this understanding that this is really about that. And I think that's exactly the same way for our sexual life and our spiritual life. That sexual life and experience is really about our spiritual life, and the spiritual life that we have is also about the sexual life. This is about that. And I think that you can see that in culture very, very quickly, very, very fastly. Right now, more than ever, the sexuality of culture is like forefront in everybody's mind, but no one is talking about the spirituality of it. Not nearly as much. And so it's funny to me that when I was doing some research, I found out there was a famous kind of philosopher, Christian thinker, theologian, G.K. Chesterton is his name. And he said, when a man goes to a brothel, he's looking for God. And it's interesting to me that then Sigmund Freud said, when a man goes to church, he's looking for sex. And that these men with very different philosophical understandings, very different approaches to how all of these things work and interconnect, both come to the same reality that these things are way closer than we ever wish to imagine, and maybe, just maybe, they're telling us something very important. And so tonight, my hope is that we can kind of look at that, talk about that, and engage with what do we think spirituality and sexuality look like, and then maybe how those things inform each other a little bit more. And we'll do lots of defining words. So our first little group session is we want to define the word sexuality and spirituality up until what you know right now. So break into your groups, and you're just going to come up with 2 or 3 words that describe, if you were to define sexuality in your own terms, what would it be? And if you were to define spirituality, how would you define it in just a few terms? And so I'm going to give you guys about 5 minutes. Like I said, groups of 3 and 4. This is a safe place. We're going to talk about these things openly as we continue in 6 weeks. I hope that you won't get disrupted by the things that we speak about. But I really would love to start with a definition of these things. So then when we talk about this, we know what we're talking about. All right? I'm going to give you 5 minutes to go, ready, set, make a group, and talk about these 2 words and come up with a good definition. One more minute. Would love for somebody to give me a couple words that come up concerning sexuality first. Sexuality, some words. Relationship. Okay, what else? What? Primal. Oh, what a good word. Human, connection. Other words. None from this side. Regeneration. Pleasure. Great. What were you saying, Pastor Michelle? Male and female. Okay, are we good? Do we need any other ones you guys feel like we haven't represented? Okay. Spirituality. Oh, relationship. Sounds kind of redundant, but I'm here for that. What else on spirituality? Internal. That's a great word. Internal. Other words. Okay. I'm going to write the word soul as like a summation. What else? Joy. Okay. What else? Spirituality. Oh man. Eternal. Okay. Little transcendent action. Dent or dant? I always forget on this one. Transcendent. E. It's an E. I know it is in my head. I was like, so, great words, super helpful. I'm going to give you a couple definitions in a second that I think are really well communicated. But before we get there, want to just talk about the word sex, because I think that is the root of sexuality, and that's really what we're kind of going after. So it comes from the Latin word sexus, which most likely comes from, it's not quite agreed on by etymologists, but it comes from the word sacare, most likely. And this word means to cut or divide. Some would say separate is another word. And I think that I want to be aware of this because I think that it's easy to read these and to think negatively, but there's also a positive aspect to it. So one is if we're cutting and dividing and separating, we're highlighting that something is different, but we're also highlighting that something is partial. So if I cut something or I divide something, it is no longer whole, it is now separated. So it's different, which is, I would say, like the positive side of things, and it's partial, because it's not complete, it's the negative side of things. And then in the realm of spirituality, I think that it's super helpful before we get into this formal definition, is that ultimately we're talking about things of a spiritual nature. And if we were to talk about something that's spiritual, we are talking about something that is non-earthy in some ways, but also some people would say is heavenly in some ways. And most often when people talk about spirituality, we're talking about God or some sort of divine being, right? Are we good on that? Does everybody feel like, okay, that's fair, there's nothing crazy as we come to it? An incredible author and writer, her name is Deborah Hirsch. She define these two words and using this simple phrase. That sexuality and spirituality, both of them are about longing. And spirituality, more than anything, is the vast longing that drives us beyond ourselves in an attempt to connect with, probe, or understand our world. And the goal of it is that we would know God. And as we know God, we would also be known by God. So there's this inherent longing, desire that's within us to know God and be known by God. The direction is it's outside of ourselves. We realize that this longing is not fulfilled within myself. And then on the flip side, she says that sexuality is that I would know another and be known by another. The same longing, desire, that I have towards God, I then also have towards another human being. And I think it's really interesting because I don't know if we naturally think that sexuality is just like the desire to know and be known by another human. And then there's like shades of what that looks like, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of different kind of knowing, right? So when I show up with my sexuality, I show up as a male, I show up with a penis, I show up with a scrotum, I show up with all of that, and you show up with whatever parts you have, right? Now, that does not mean that we are trying to have genital knowledge because we're interacting with each other, right? But we are wanting to be known by each other, and we want to know each other, right? So we'll call that like a social sexuality, okay? So it's social only. We never move towards the place where genitals are involved. And then we also know there's genital sexuality, where we want to know somebody and be known by somebody in a genital-driven way, right? The problem is, for most of our sexuality, is that we have lived in a world that has shaped and formed us to purely live for genital sexuality and have completely neglected most social sexuality. Maybe that feels a little uncomfortable to process, but at the end of the day, some of the theologians that I'm reading are saying our problems that we have are because we don't have social sexuality. Because we don't know how to interact with people who are the same sex as us or the opposite sex as us. And because we don't know how to do that, we don't know how to know each other, we don't know how to be known, and it brings us to a place of disorder. Or, even worse, I would say it brings us to a place of idolatry. Because what we've done is we've idolized genital sexuality in our culture, right? When I meet somebody online, on an app, most of the world is immediately thinking about sexual compatibility. And I didn't think that this was the case, and so I started to interact with more and more people, and they're like basically swiping because of a physical look, right? In the same way, if you rewind to back when I was a young person, I remember when Facebook just came out for the very first time. That's how old I am. And I remember people processing, add that girl, add that guy. Like, it was all based on their face. And so much of how we live our lives is all about that physical reality and a whole lot less of that social reality. So I just want to put that out there as we're talking about these things. There's multiple dimensions to our sexuality. At the same token, when it comes to our spirituality about knowing God and being known by God, this is also a vast expression of what does it look like to interact with God and know him and be known by him. Different traditions have different approaches. NewSong is like a really diverse population, and so some people are like, oh, I know God through what? The Bible. I'm very scriptural. Other people are like, oh, I know God through my experiences with God, or how maybe I've had a vision of God, or maybe I've had, some sort of encounter with God, or maybe some people are like, oh, everything I know about God is what I would learn from my parents or from my church, and so there's kind of doctrines that are governing how I know it. And so all I'm trying to say is that both of these things are coming at us in the same way, but in a different way, and they all are connected and based to this longing that we need something outside of ourselves. This is really about that. And so in our social relationships, in our sexual relationships, in our spiritual moments that we have, all of this is telling us that we deeply desire for more. And I think a huge part of that is in our bodies. Because at the end of the day, our longings, both spiritually and sexually, deeply get connected to our bodies. It's not just a thought. It's not just a feeling. It's our physical bodies, and that matters. Okay. So I think it's interesting, though, if you think about it in all this way, Deborah Hirsch highlights, and I think she did an incredible job making this connection, that all of our life is loving God and loving others, right? This is the great commandment. And so this conversation is about how are we bringing those things together and not trying to separate them all apart. And so hopefully as we come together into this thing, we can ask the questions very honestly, why am I not loving God? Why am I not loving other people? Why does my sex life not feel great or seem great? Why does my spirituality seem dead and dull? It's all driven by this same longing to be able to experience life fully in your body. And I think that's a powerful thing for us to start off with. If we can start at that point and just get there without going crazy further, if we can just get to the moment where I'm realizing that all of this is happening in my body, that I know that I am not complete, that my body tells me that, because what? I cannot self-generate, right? Like I do not have the ability to bring life out of myself without someone else. And that's the same thing in the realm of my spirituality, that I cannot figure my spirituality on my own. I need my spirituality to be informed by someone outside of my body. So all that to say, I want to go back to the beginning where all of this started from, because I think all of these longings, all of our body challenges, all of our sexuality and spirituality issues go back to the very beginning where it was all originated, where humanity was created. And when we can read through this and walk through this and understand this, I think it really helps us understand how can we possibly be the most incredible humans that we can be in. So Genesis chapter 1, we're going to be reading through some of the creation story. If you're not familiar with this story, it is the creation of the world. All sorts of people have lots of opinions about this first couple of chapters in the book. Some people say it's scientific. Some people say that it's poetry. Some people are like, it's metaphorical. Some people say, no, it's literal. There's all of these things that people say about Genesis and about this first couple chapters. And what I would like to pose to you tonight is that all of it is about God and humans and the world that we are in with God, with humans, and with the world that we're in. And that's the whole idea, is that it is a big, beautiful framework and picture on how do we understand everything in our existence. And we can talk about all the things, but tonight we're just going to be talking about what does it mean to be human. So it says in Genesis 1 that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over all the waters. And then it goes through a whole litany of things that God created, amazing, beautiful things. And then it comes to verse 26, and it says, and then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and the livestock and all the wild animals on the earth and the small animals that scurry along the ground. Verse 27, so God created human beings in his own image, and in the image of God, he created them. And then verse 28, then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it, reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground. Skip down to 31, and God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was very good. So in our hearts and our minds, as we come into this conversation about sexuality and spirituality, the thing that we have to constantly bring before us is that God made humans in his image, and it was very good. And what does that mean for us? And I think that it means a lot of things, and I'm hoping that we can unpack this passage together. And I kept asking the question, what is the goal of reading through this passage? And I think the goal came in form of a song. But I still haven't found what I'm looking for, right? Because at the end of all of my sexuality and all of my spirituality, I am still looking for something. And I'm like, I was like writing down, like, what are we looking for in all of these longings and all of this desire? What do we want? And I kept coming back to that this longing brings me to this place where I'm looking, which I love because it says that God looked at everything and he said it was very good. And so I'm looking for something that's very good. I'm looking for something that is aesthetically correct. I'm looking for something that has a picture and an image because that matters to me as a human. Because when I come into this universe, I am trying to see everything. And it takes a while. Little babies do not see right away. But that's the goal, is that we would see. And if we could see everything rightly, that's part of this desire. That's part of what we're looking for. So it says this in this, and I want to just unpack these terms. So it says, and God said, let us make human beings. So human beings, very first word that I want us to just unpack, talk about, etc., is the word Adam. In Hebrew, Adam is a very special word. It turns into a name of the first male represented in Scripture, named Adam, is how we say it most of the time. But Adam is a really powerful word because it's a generic word for humanity or humankind. It oftentimes means to be red and ruddy. And it often has the picture of youthful vigor. It's kind of like when kids are running all the time and their cheeks are always flushed and red. There's this youthful vigor and virility about them. That is the picture of humanity, that they were teeming and full of life. In fact, so interestingly, that this word Adam is connected to the word dam. And the word dam often is translated as the word blood. What does blood do when your cheeks are red? Makes them red. And so there's something very beautiful about recognizing that Dam is this blood. It's the life of an entity. It's the life of a human being. It's the life of humankind is inside of them, and it's teeming, and it's moving, and it's alive, and it's active, and it's contained. Now we see that at the very beginning that it says that God, created everything in the beginning, and that the spirit of water, what did it do? It was moving over the waters. That there was a life force that was happening, that was moving and causing for something creative to occur. There was a life outside of the earth that came into the earth and caused for everything to be created, made, shifted, and changed. And in the same way, humanity as a human being, we have contained in us all of that life that was outside of us. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. It's interesting that if the blood leaves the body, that's what they call death. Which makes sense, right? If I cut you open and you bleed all out, you will die. We have a nurse, he can affirm that this is true. And And so I was laughing in my mind because what I started to realize is that in our calling for humanity, in the longing, in the looking for, we're looking for life above everything else. And it's why so often in our spirituality, we run to sexuality because it feels really lively. Oh, come on. It feels very lively. But anyone will tell you that at the end of that, it doesn't often feel lively anymore. You know that the French, I can't believe this is coming to my mind. The French, they have this picture that comes that when orgasm occurs, they call it the little death. Have you ever heard this? They call it the little death because literally a giving of life is happening from male and female in that moment, and there is a little death happening because it's all about life. Your sexuality and your spirituality are all about life, the life that you want with God and the life that you want with others, and how all of those things need order. Because if they're not ordered, then life pours out all over the place, and what happens? Death. But when there's order and life comes into the places that it's supposed to be, then everything is very good. Next word in the passage. It says, and God said, let us make human beings in our image. Just want to throw that out. First it says our, plural. That means that God is creating from his plurality, that he is creating from his fullness. You can look at it two ways. In the Hebrew world, when something is plural, it just means there's a whole lot to it. And so maybe there's a whole lot more to God than we know in this specific moment of him creating things. Or it can also assume that there is a fellowship, which, as creedal Christians here at NewSong Church, we believe that God is three persons in one substance, also called the Trinity. And we believe that. And so from his Trinitarian nature of three persons in one essence, we believe he created humanity in that same way, in that image. Now, the image word is really important. The rudiments of this word is shade. Shade? Why? Image, shade. Because if I'm standing there in front of you and something's behind me and there's an image of me behind me, it's because of shade. And so there's this depiction that each human, we are a shade of God. That we are in all of who he is, the wonder and the incredibleness and the beauty of him, that we are an outline of him in some ways that's not fully formed in some regards, but is partially formed. We have a good shape around us. And the New Testament talks a lot about how we need to get into that shape more. It talked about conformity, get into that form. We talked about transform, to change your form as well in the New Testament, tons of that. But in this moment, I think it's also important to find out that this word image here, which is the word tselem in Hebrew, that this word is also where we get the word idol from. And this is imperative for us to understand. Because in the ancient Near Eastern world, when they're talking about images and they're talking about idols, they are talking about a container for a divine creature. So for instance, if you went into a temple and it was to the deity of love, you would expect that there would be a container in that temple that you would walk up to and expect the divine creature to reside in that image. We don't think about idols like that. We're like, oh, they're just like dead rocks, you know. But in their mind, it was a container for the deity. The crazy thing is that all throughout the Hebrew world and culture that's happening, all throughout Genesis, there is no container that is made of stone. There is a container that is a body. And it's humankind, Adam. And so it's really important for us to recognize, because we have been fashioned and formed to carry the divine in everything we do, whether it's in our spirituality or sexuality, because they're really the same. He wants us to be like him. That's, one of the other words that's in here, to be like us. It's just another picture of a model or a pattern or the appearance of the God that you are coming into alignment with or coming into the shadow of. He says in this verse that they will reign. Now, I want to just talk about this real quick because I think part of our human reality is our ability to reign. Now, when we think reign, we get like very now culture and how reigning looks, and we're all looking for power and authority and strength and honor and, Maximus Meridius Decimus. We're looking for that kind of picture of reigning. But I think it's really beautiful because this idea is that we would learn to be those who could take care and keep and till and manage all of the existing things that have been made. You want to know the most interesting thing when I was reading about this is that this idea of reigning always has to do with created things and not reigning over created persons. This is crucial to understand, that our rule and our reign is never to reign over another human. It's only to rule and reign over the created things that God has made. And this is crucial in our understanding, because if you think that it's about ruling and reigning another person, then you have now adopted a different divine picture of a idol image of a God who rules and reigns over human in subjugation, which we believe in freedom. And so we don't believe that it's all subjugation. We believe that he gave permission for them to express themselves in certain ways, sexually and spiritually, that are good sometimes and are not good sometimes because of who he is in his imaging. It says in this passage, then, 27, so in Hebrew, there's this whole thing that they do. And they love to say it one way and then flip it and say it the same way but backwards. And that's what happens here. It says, so God created human beings in his own image, and in the image of God, it's the same image, he created them, same words. And then kind of the stamp on it is male and female, he created them. So it's this beautiful little poem of sort that's trying to make a point of how God created them. And I just want to highlight on what the stamp is, that it's male and female, he created them. Now, these two words have been words that have been talked about a ton, but I feel like it's really important for us to highlight them. The first is the word male. And this idea of male really is most connected to the Hebrew word that means to remember. Where you're like, what? Why does male have to do with remembering? And it's because that the idea of male basically means the ability to call upon, the ability to remember something, the remember to call towards. A lot of times it has this depiction in this picture that you are there to be connected to another person, to be a reminder to them of everything that's happening. Some would say that you could take this picture further than words, and you could say that that this male, that he has the ability to pierce into the history. And as he pierces into the history, he can pull back all the good that needs to be remembered and called upon in that moment. So there is a certain sense of something that is pushed outward from the male in order to retrieve and bring life. Okay? Now, and it also has words like memorial connected to it, a monument connected to it, and really, because we're talking about these beautiful humans in this world that the God of the universe created, there's a sense that he is an assistant of the king that is there to represent all the things that the king has said and communicated. And that is his calling, that's his job. We'll talk about it more next week, but part of it is that that is a priestly role to remember. And so there's something priestly happening here as well, where there's a whole lot more that we'll talk about next week when we talk about what does it mean to be holy, and priesthood and temples and all those things that are connected to this. The female here is the word nekavah, and the best way I think it can be translated is one who has hollows in them. Meaning that there is spaces that are within them that are able to hold and carry things, which we know is really beautiful. to think about. Something like a womb would be considered a hollow. Now, that doesn't mean she's empty. That doesn't mean that she doesn't have something. That is not what that means. It just means that her design formation is that she would be the one who could carry things, which is so powerful and so beautiful. So if his ability is to be able to pull things out and bring things to, and she has the ability to carry things, we have this beautiful depiction of how God operates even within himself. And I think that that's really helpful for us to process. Because in some ways, they're beginning to demonstrate what is the process of relating to each other, whether it's sexually or spiritually. Because it's very similar. That there's one who is able to carry something, and there's one who's bringing a piece of something to bring into the other one who is the carrier. Like I said, this is pure equality. There is no indication that there is anything less than equality happening within humanity. Because human beings is the word that contains male and female. So, as we get into chapter 2 is kind of the unfurling of what was just discussed and talked about. And we get a lot more pictures and understanding of this male and female in this beautiful picture, because I think it's very easy to just like assume that we understand what's going on here, but there's so much more. So I want us to highlight a few things. So first thing is that it talks about how God formed man. So it says that he took him like clay, dirt from the ground, and that as he took that ruddy clay, he then breathed his spirit into it. And so we get a very clear picture of what does it mean to be a sexual and spiritual human, which is something that has a form that has life inside of it. It's just going to be the consistent picture we're going to come back to, that is a shape and it's a form. It's a body, and then there's something, like we said, eternal, soul, transcendent inside, a very temporal picture and reality that we have. Not temporal in this moment, but we find out it gains temporality because of some things that happen. In chapter 2 as well, we also get kind of the process of how God created male and female. And basically it starts with man is alone, and that there is not another kind that is like him, which goes back to our social picture here, that God is like, hey, you don't even have the ability to relate to the animals in a socially sexual way. We need to do something about that. And so he's like, you know what? Like, I think I should make a helper who's right for him. Now, I really wish that like every translation didn't translate a helper. It's really not a great translation. If you can just do a simple Google search of the word ezer, E-Z-E-R is the Hebrew word, and look at every other verse inside the entire Bible, and almost always it's connected to God. And almost always, which if you don't know this, you should, it means deliverer, it means rescuer, it means saver. It's normally in a military context. It normally means that they rescue from a dangerous moment or a non-ideal situation. And it almost always has the preposition in this passage that means face to face, or as a mirror, or right next to. And so God is saying, as I looked at humanity, I realized there was no mirror that could possibly bring rescue and safety to this one. And so I'm going to make a woman. I'm going to make another being so that we can have the whole picture expressed and demonstrated. And so he puts man to sleep, which if you read, this is not just a normal sleep. This is like a divine slumber that happens very regularly. And it says that he literally takes half of humanity, half of Adam, and he splits it in half. We normally hear rib, right? Bad translation. It can mean rib. It also can mean a beam, like in a temple or in a building, like a giant beam that holds things up. But most often it really is side. So you just side a human being, if I side a human being and I split it in half, that is how God makes this woman. And so it's beautiful because it's this picture of one thing becoming two things. Now, if you go back and you read in chapter 1, what you see consistently is the huge reality that creation is always taking things that are whole, dividing them, and then sometimes putting them back together. So for instance, it's like, let's take all the water and gather them in one place, ocean, land, and then like, let's also move it around and split it in rivers and everything, you know? So there's this sense of like putting things together and dividing them and putting things together and dividing them. And that is for the expansion of creation. In the same reality for humanity, that as God splits Adam, one humankind being that has everything inside of him in chapter 1, that splitting of male and female is he is now made two from one. But that means that those two are begging and longing to be one again. So that we can what? Expand humanity. Because if we don't have two, there's no expansion. Just like in the realm of who God is, in the Trinitarian expression of who he is, that he is constantly wanting to expand. In fact, there's so many Trinitarian pictures that say that the love of the Father and the love of the Son were so self-giving and so wonderfully overflowing that a whole other person in the Spirit was there because of it. And there's this the depiction of generative life and pouring out that you cannot hold all the Dom in you. You cannot hold all the life and all the blood in you. You have to expand it. You have to make it bigger. And the only way to do that is by having two coming together into one so that more can come. Because two is never enough. It's always begging for three. And then it's begging for 4 and 5 and 6 and 5. But we're expecting with our 5th kid, so lots of that. And I think that this is so powerful for us because what we realize is that in this maleness and in this femaleness, there is a sameness because they came from the same thing, but there's also this difference. And that is good. And when we talk about the Trinity, we say that they are the same, but they are different. And so the language that we use spiritually in the sense of the Trinity is the same language that we talk about sexually, that is the same, but it is different. And the necessity of bringing those things back together and back apart and back together and back apart is the way life perpetuates itself. So if I have a social interaction with you that is life-giving, there is a certain sexuality and spirituality to that, even though there's no genitals involved. Or you can have a genital relationship with your spouse and life can come forward and you have a child and it's wonderful and beautiful both in a sexual and a spiritual way. Because it's an expansion of life, it's expansion of the kingdom, it's expansion of how God wants things to be. Because what does he say in chapter 1 is that he wants them to multiply in all ways, sexually and spiritually. That it's never a containment. And this doesn't mean that you as an individual is not enough without your complement. What it means is that you get to find ways to be sexual and spiritual without it being genital, which is what we all can learn how to do better. Because our culture and our world tend to tell us that it's only sexual union that can really tell you anything or really mean anything in the terms of you being a human, which is unfortunately not true. You can find all the life without being married. And we know this because in the New Testament, we get great depictions of this. Spoiler alert, come when Pastor Michelle talks about Jesus as a spiritual sexual being, and he was not married. So far so good? Everyone great? All right. Everyone's just breathing deeply, wigging out a little bit. There is something beautiful about this that I think helps us recognize that in the nature of these spaces of coming together and coming apart and coming together and coming apart, this dividing and separating, this difference and partiality, that when we have that, it becomes the depiction of what order looks like. For if we were to only be just about physical procreation, etc., we truly become only animalistic. Truly. Pleasure seeking, that's it. It's very animalistic. The problem is that in sometimes in the church, then we divorce ourselves completely of that. And we're like, oh, we're never going to talk about sex. And like I said in the beginning, I learned more from sex in the library than I did in the church. And then you try to live some sort of angelic reality. bodiless, empty, floating, but spiritual. But we have to come back to this longing that's in our bodies, that's asking us that humanity is the only place where sexuality and spirituality combine and come together. That unified longing is the way that God desires to save the world. And that's Jesus. But in our lives, it's how he wants to save our lives, both spiritually or sexually or however, is that he's like, hey, I want you to figure out social sexuality. I want you to figure out genital sexuality. I want you to figure out how you can have a spirituality with me that feels life-giving and feels like you come into the relationship hollow, expecting me to be the one who fills you. I know we don't like to talk about this, but in the Bible, the church is the hollowed out one. I think sometimes the church thinks that we are not the hollowed out ones and that we are trying to get God to be the hollowed out ones that carries whatever we say we want and we desire. I don't want to go into it too much, but that is almost every other religious system in the world. Egypt is a primary example, so is Babel, and if you know anything about Egypt and Babel, they are always the opposite ways that God wants the Israelites to do things, and they're obsessed with the earth penetrating the sky. Literally, the God of the earth penetrates the sky in form of an obelisk. I'm just trying to get you to understand the sexual, spiritual stuff is everywhere in the ancient Near East, and that they really did believe that the only way they could be divine was to build things upward that would penetrate heavenly things. What do you think the Tower of Babel is? All of these things are penetrative in nature and non-receptive and non-hollowed. And unfortunately, I would say the tradition of this church, being one that was charismatic, we have been taught for years to bang on heaven instead of being receptive for whatever God is bringing to us. And you see, Pastor Alvin's been talking about it. A great example of this is Mary. That she is a womb. You can see this with Sarah. You can see this with Hannah. That God is looking for people who will have womb-like emptiness. That when they come to him, he can come and fill them up. That I'm not trying to grab and take from God. I am open hands receiving whatever God is bringing me. And that's the spirituality that we're being invited into, that heals and orders my spirituality and heals my sexuality. Because if I am a taker in my sexuality, that is disordered. It becomes violent. And if you take that out logically, you see that there is not love at the end of that. But if you come into your spirituality and you come into your sexuality as a giver and not a taker, then you end up in the place of love. Because love is always self-giving. So in all of this, what I'm hoping you can take away, 734, we're doing good, is when we're defining humanity and we're thinking about these things, we have to wrestle with the reality and the beautiful picture of, I am unbelievably unique as male or female, and that is a beautiful thing. I was created for life beyond myself, and yet I am part of a collective. It's not just about me and what I want. In my sexuality and my spirituality, it's not just about me. I was created for life with others. I was created to have connections. I was created to be recreative in my connections. I was created to move towards peace and reconciliation. That if I feel division, my calling is to come back together. This is the depiction of how God is trying to invite humans to come into it. That God's like, oh, hey, by the way, a man and a woman, they shall come together. Which we're going to hear more about that in a couple weeks. From the end of chapter 2, where once God makes him, man's like, at last, he exclaims, this one is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She'll be called woman because she was taken from me out of my side. And this explains why a man leaves his father and his mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are what? United into one. Powerful. That we are not just biologically talking about sexuality and spirituality of body and soul. We're not just talking about penises and vaginas. We're not just talking about that. We're also talking about something theological. Or another way of saying it, we're talking about the gospel. That all of this is about the gospel, that you might feel separated and disconnected and very different from God and very partial because you are, and your longing is just to what? To have right relationship, to know God and be known by him. And then in the same way with another person. Whether that's through the community, the collective, friendships and relationships, brothers and sisters in God, or the person who God says, I want you to expressly express this with one other individual and multiply it with your spouse. This is the gospel. This is theological. Humanity is a sexual image of God because it is generative. You were made to generate life. Yes, I know there are exceptions where people have a hard time having children, etc. That doesn't mean you're not generative. You are still generating life because remember, the dom, the life is in your container, whether it's just in your sexuality or it's in your spirituality. There's lots of ways to mother and father in a non-sexual way. There's lots of ways to be a member of the community that is so generative and so life-giving and so poured out that it is just as powerful as the simple act of sex. We have creative organs. We were made for fruitful connections. Our love and our reproduction yields family, which is the point. That like the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, we would also be like them. Just like it reminds us in the scriptures in John, chapter 14 and in John 10 that I and the Father are one and I will send the Spirit who is just like me to you. It's all recognizing that all of our separateness, all of our disconnections are calling us back to want to be one with each other and with God. And so when that happens, we get to step into a beautiful picture of what does it mean to be new creation. And when we live in that way, we can learn socially, sexually, spiritually, how we can live an ordered reality where peace governs everything that we do, and everything is the way it should be, and everything is at rest. All of that to say that the invitation for the rest of this series, I think, is an invitation into understanding what does it mean to be truly intimate. Whether you're talking spiritually, whether you're talking the two different sexualities that we talked about, the social sexuality, which is based on who you are as a sexed human, versus your sexual genital sexuality that has to do with the specific male and female parts that come together. And in all of those things, the question is how can you be intimate? And this is the simple invitation that I think is there for us. Is that we would learn to be people who disclose ourselves to others in all of these fashions and ways. And we look that when someone discloses themselves to us, that we embrace them. And that is intimacy. Because when the God of the universe reveals himself to be the creator God, and he discloses himself to the earth, then they are able to embrace who he is more fully. And that depiction of them coming together is how knowledge occurs. That when I share with you and you receive it and you hold it tightly, we then become connected in that knowing. And so for us, many of us have to learn how to be more intimate. Now, I know that the world has commandeered this, and in fact, the word intimacy has been commandeered to be a sexual euphemism. But did you know that if you go back and you research it, it's very rarely connected with sexuality in the sense of genital sexuality. Most often, I love this word, it's connected with we-ness. That intimacy is the ness that we feel when we are together. And I think we need more of that. And how so much of our lives and hearts and existences would be healed and made whole so we can be holy humans when we come into more we-ness with each other. maybe a little less penis and a little bit more weeness. That just came in my head, and I was like, I'm sharing that one. Not my notes. Pulling a Pastor Alvin. My hope is that as we come into this understanding of intimacy, as we come into this understanding of what does it mean to be human, we really would begin to ask ourselves the question, am I looking for intimacy where I do not disclose myself? If I live that way, I've become violent and I'm just a taker. Or if I refuse to embrace somebody, I'm pushing them away, that is also a violence. And that is one way that intimacy happens, unfortunately. But it is not the way of God to be taking and pushing. That the way of intimacy for us is one that is peaceful, that is forgiving. That we are willing to give each other ourselves in any and every way. Whether it's somebody who we're married to in a sexual reality or if it's in a social reality. That I'd be willing to give of myself freely to you because that is a demonstration of God. That he is giving and he exists for giving. And that when we take that forgiving to the fullness, it's forgiveness. And that my witness becomes my reality of forgiveness. And that my witness with somebody else becomes the witness of my we-ness with people. And then everybody in the whole world goes, so you're not just living for you, huh? Because no one lives like this. Everyone is living to take for themselves. And they've bought into the idea that intimacy is about my power instead of realizing that my intimacy is about my love. Not the cheap love the world likes to talk about. The kind of love that 1 Corinthians talks about, which is a crazy, insane love that refuses to focus on self. Because at the end of the day, my longings tell me the truth, that I am not satisfied on my own. I have to have God, and I have to have everyone else. And hopefully, he'll provide for me somebody specific to demonstrate that love to. And if not, there's a whole lot of other people that I can find that with until that time. Can I pray for you guys? Jesus, help us with our intimacy. Help us recognize the revealing nature of who you are and the receptive nature that we can be for each other, that we would embrace one another in our sharing, in our openness. Lord, I pray that we would recognize that closeness in all of these spaces, spiritually and sexually, it all comes back to, will we be receivers of who you are? Will we be containers of your love and your kindness and your goodness? Will we be containers of your maleness? Will we be containers of your femaleness in our humanity, learning to demonstrate and show the whole picture of the kind of creature that you want to have relationship with? Lord, you created us because you couldn't contain yourself. Your love was too much. Lord, I pray that we would become those same kind of containers that would love so fully and so richly that everyone would experience the life outside of our container. The life that they can catch when they're in conversations with us or when they're discussing things with us. And Lord, that we would be people who would be able to say, God, thank you for making me in your image, male and female in your image. Thank you for making us humans with bodies. And thank you for putting spirits inside of our bodies so that we might know you. We just ask that you would help us, open these things up to us, show us all of the things about you that's in this, that all of the dividing that we might feel is calling us back into wholeness. That every difficult moment of separation and disconnection is just an invitation for reconciliation and wholeness. We love you so much, Jesus. And we thank you for your perfect example of how to be a holy human. We ask all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Come back next week. We're going to talk about what does it mean to be holy in our holy human experience and the power of holiness and how it's not what you think. It's not rules and regulations. It's so much more about living the life that God's called us to live. Love you guys. Have a great time. Grab your kids. See you on Sunday.